Did you feel it too? From one day to the next, something changed. It wasn't just a feeling. Some people say they woke up and simply knew that something had shifted. Not in the world outside, but within reality itself. And you may have gone through it without even realizing. Nothing announced it. There was no warning. Life kept moving. The same places, the same faces, the same routines. And yet, beneath that surface, something no longer sat the same way. A quiet mismatch you couldn't explain. Have you ever felt like everything looked the same but wasn't? As if you crossed an invisible line and suddenly the old rules didn't fully apply anymore? Conversations felt slightly off. Time behaved differently. Certain things lost their meaning while others gained an unexpected weight. This isn't about imagination or drama. It's about perception changing before the mind can catch up. A subtle shift that doesn't ask for belief, only honesty. Because once that invisible line is crossed, reality doesn't feel solid in the same way again. And the question isn't whether it happened. It's whether you noticed when it did. At first, nothing announced itself as different. You woke up, followed the same routine, looked at the same streets, the same screens, the same faces. If someone had asked you what changed, you might have said, nothing. And yet, beneath that surface normality, something felt off in a way that was hard to name. Not dramatic, not explosive, subtle, almost quiet. Like a room you know well where someone has slightly moved the furniture in the dark. It often begins with small disruptions that don't seem important enough to mention. Time feels strange. The day passes too fast, or it stretches in an unusual way. You check the clock more often, not because you're in a hurry, but because something in you is trying to confirm where you are. Moments repeat. Numbers catch your attention. You hear the same phrase twice in one day from two different places. You brush it off at first. Coincidence is an easy answer. It keeps things comfortable. But then there's the inner shift. A kind of silence appears where noise used to live. Thoughts that once ran automatically begin to slow down, not because you forced them to, but because they no longer carry the same urgency. You find yourself staring out of a window, or pausing mid-task, not lost, not distracted, just present in a way that feels unfamiliar, as if your attention has stepped half a pace back from the world. People around you may start to feel slightly different too. It's not that they changed overnight, it's more that you notice them in a new way. Conversations repeat themselves, but they land flat. Jokes you used to laugh at feel empty. Complaints that once pulled you in now sound distant, like a radio playing in another room. You listen, you respond, but something in you doesn't fully enter anymore. You're there, but not entirely there. This is often when the mind tries to regain control. It looks for explanations. Maybe you're tired, maybe you're bored, maybe it's stress. Those explanations aren't wrong, but they're incomplete, because what's happening isn't a problem that needs fixing. It's a perception that has quietly adjusted, like your eyes adapting to a different light. You may notice an odd mix of familiarity and strangeness. The world looks the same, but it doesn't feel the same. Places you know well seem flatter, almost like sets instead of living environments. Habits you relied on lose their grip. You do them because you always have, not because they still make sense. There can be a faint sense of grief here, though you might not recognize it as such. A mourning for a version of reality that no longer fully holds you. At the same time, there's a thin thread of clarity running through the confusion, a quiet knowing that something is aligning, even if you can't explain with words what that alignment is. It's not excitement, it's not fear. It's more like standing at a crossroads before any signs appear, aware that movement has already begun. What makes this phase so disorienting is how ordinary it looks from the outside. No one stops you to say, "This is the day everything changed." There's no announcement, no visible marker. That's why many people miss it entirely. They feel the discomfort and immediately try to numb it, distract from it, or push it away. They rush to fill the silence because silence feels like emptiness when you don't yet know how to listen. But if you don't rush, if you let that subtle difference exist without labeling it, you start to sense that this wasn't random. The cracks in normality aren't flaws, they're openings. The strange calm, the mild detachment, the sense that you're slightly out of sync with the old rhythm of life, all of it is preparing space. Space for something that doesn't come from effort or search, but from encounter. Because for most people, this shift doesn't remain abstract for long. At some point, something appears. It could be so small you almost dismiss it. A sentence you read, an image that lingers, a meeting that feels charged in a way you can't rationalize, a dream that stays with you after you wake. And when it happens, you realize that the day everything looked the same was actually the day you became available to notice what had been waiting to show itself. After that quiet shift, the world didn't rush to explain itself. Instead, it waited. And then, almost without warning, something appeared. Not always in a way that looked important, not wrapped in drama or mystery. Often it arrived disguised as something ordinary, something you might have scrolled past or encountered 100 times before. The difference was not in what appeared, but in how it landed inside you. It could have been a sentence that stopped you mid-breath. You read it once, then again, feeling as if it was reading you back. Or an image that lingered longer than it should have, pulling your attention without effort. Maybe it was a conversation where one simple remark echoed in your mind long after it ended. On the surface, it was nothing special, but internally, it created a clear before and after. This is the moment many people try to explain away. They say, "It's just a post," or "It was just a coincidence," or "I'm probably projecting meaning onto it." And that may sound reasonable, but reason doesn't explain why your body reacted before your thoughts did, why your chest tightened slightly, or your breathing slowed, or your eyes filled with emotion you couldn't name. You didn't decide to feel something. It happened. What marked this moment wasn't visibility. It was resonance. Something in you recognized something in what appeared, like two frequencies briefly aligning. Not because you were searching for it, but because you were open enough to notice when it arrived. That recognition didn't come with instructions. It came with a sense of being addressed directly, even though no one was speaking to you. This is why it's often described as a presence rather than an event. A presence doesn't need form to be real. You don't see the wind, but you feel when it moves through a room. In the same way, this turning point carried a weight that couldn't be measured by logic. It didn't shout. It didn't demand belief. It simply stood there, undeniable in its quiet certainty. For some, this moment feels intimate, almost private, as if it was meant only for them. You may have felt a sudden stillness, followed by a gentle but firm inner shift, like something locking into place. Not excitement, not fear, but a calm alertness. A sense that something had been activated even if you had no language for what that something was. What's important to understand is that this presence didn't come to change your life all at once. It came to change your position within it. Before, you were moving through reality mostly on habit and momentum. After this moment, you were no longer fully asleep inside your own experience. A line had been crossed, not outwardly, but inwardly. You might have noticed that from that point on, you couldn't quite return to the way you were before. Even when you tried to ignore it, the feeling stayed. Not as pressure, but as a quiet reference point. Like knowing a door exists behind you, even if you choose not to open it yet. Life continued, but something fundamental had shifted in how you related to it. There's often a temptation here to grasp for meaning, to label the experience, to define it, to turn it into a belief or identity, but this presence resists being turned into a concept. The more you try to pin it down, the more it slips away. It wasn't meant to be understood immediately. It was meant to be felt and allowed. And once that presence has made itself known, it doesn't disappear. It becomes a subtle background signal, influencing how you perceive everything that follows. You begin to notice what feels aligned and what feels off, what drains you and what quietly strengthens you. Without realizing it, your tolerance for what is empty starts to fade. That's when another change begins to unfold. The same environments, routines, and relationships that once felt solid start to lose their depth. Not because they are wrong, but because they belong to a version of reality you are no longer fully inhabiting. The presence didn't remove you from the world. It adjusted your lens. And through that adjusted lens, the colors of your old life begin to soften, preparing you for the strange sense that something familiar is slowly dissolving. After that moment of recognition, life didn't collapse or transform overnight. It continued, almost stubbornly, in the same shapes and schedules. And yet something essential began to drain away from it. Not meaning exactly, but intensity. The world you moved through started to feel thinner, like a photograph that had been left in the sun too long. The outlines were still there, but the color no longer held. You might have noticed it in places you once felt comfortable. A cafe you loved now felt oddly quiet, even when it was full. A routine that gave you structure began to feel mechanical, as if you were playing a role you had already outgrown. You showed up, you participated, but there was a sense of watching yourself from a slight distance, like an actor repeating lines that no longer land the same way. This can be confusing, because nothing is obviously wrong. Your life may look stable from the outside. Responsibilities are met, conversations continue, yet internally there's a growing sense of flatness. Not sadness, not depression, but a lack of texture. The emotional highs and lows that once defined your days smooth out into something neutral, almost muted. And that neutrality can feel unsettling if you're used to measuring life by reaction. People often misinterpret this phase as losing interest or motivation. They tell themselves they need to try harder, be more grateful, push through. And while effort has its place, this isn't something effort can fix. Because what's fading isn't your capacity to feel. It's your attachment to patterns that no longer match where your awareness is settling. You may start to notice that certain conversations feel repetitive in a way they never did before. The same worries, the same complaints, the same goals circling without movement. You listen, but it's as if the sound passes through you instead of into you. There's no judgment in this, but there is a quiet recognition. This frequency no longer holds your attention. Even pleasures can change. Things that once brought excitement or escape begin to feel hollow after a short while. You enjoy them briefly, then sense an emptiness underneath, like eating something sweet that never quite satisfies hunger. This doesn't mean those things are bad. It means they were designed for a different stage of perception. What's difficult here is the temptation to blame yourself. You might wonder if you're becoming detached, ungrateful, or disconnected from life. But what's actually happening is more precise than that. Your awareness has sharpened, and with it, your sensitivity to what is alive versus what is habitual. Color fades where there is no genuine engagement. There can also be a subtle loneliness in this phase, not because you are alone, but because fewer things truly meet you where you are now. You may find yourself craving depth without knowing exactly what that depth looks like yet. Superficial interactions exhaust you more quickly. Silence begins to feel more honest than forced connection. And still, there's no clear replacement. The old world is losing its vibrancy, but the new one hasn't fully revealed itself. This in-between space can feel disorienting, like standing in a room where the lights have dimmed, waiting for your eyes to adjust. You're not meant to rush through this. The fading is part of the recalibration. It's important to notice that this loss of color isn't happening everywhere at once. Certain moments may suddenly feel brighter by contrast. A simple observation, a quiet walk, a fleeting feeling of alignment when you're alone with your thoughts. These small points of clarity stand out against the dullness, hinting at a different way of engaging with reality that doesn't rely on constant stimulation. As this continues, you may feel an urge to pull away, to simplify, to reduce noise without fully understanding why. This isn't withdrawal, it's refinement. Your system is learning what no longer needs to be amplified. And as that process deepens, confusion can surface alongside fatigue. You might question whether you're losing your grip, whether this numbness means something is wrong. But beneath that doubt, another understanding is forming. This isn't collapse, it's reorganization. The color didn't disappear to leave you empty. It faded to reveal what was never truly yours to carry. And as that realization settles in, the discomfort begins to shift into something else, preparing you for the moment when you stop interpreting this strange state as loss and begin to recognize it as a form of awakening that doesn't look dramatic, but changes everything. At this point, it's common to think something is going wrong. When the familiar loses its grip and the old reference points stop working, the mind looks for a reason, and the easiest explanation is loss of control. You may notice moments of confusion, fatigue that doesn't come from physical effort, or a strange sensitivity to things that never bothered you before. From the inside, it can feel like you're unraveling. From the outside, nothing seems dramatic enough to justify that feeling. But this isn't collapse, it's adjustment. Control depends on predictability. It relies on patterns you've learned to manage the world, how people respond, how situations unfold, how you should act to get certain outcomes. When those patterns begin to loosen, the sense of control weakens. That doesn't mean you are failing. It means you are no longer operating on autopilot. Awakening doesn't arrive as clarity at first. It often arrives as disorientation. The nervous system has to recalibrate to a wider field of awareness, and during that process, old signals misfire. You may feel overstimulated in environments that once felt normal. Noise, crowds, even certain conversations can drain you quickly. This isn't fragility, it's perception becoming more refined. There may also be emotional waves that seem to come from nowhere. You feel deeply one moment, flat the next. Memories surface unexpectedly. Questions you never asked before begin to demand attention. The mind wants to organize all of this, to label it, to fix it. But the more it tries to clamp down, the more tension you feel. Control, in this phase, creates friction. What's actually happening is that awareness is moving from the background to the foreground. Before, most of your life was guided by inherited beliefs, social conditioning, and unconscious habits. Now those layers are becoming visible. And when something becomes visible, it can no longer run you in the same way. That visibility can feel like instability, because you're no longer being carried by momentum alone. You might notice a growing discomfort with pretending, saying things you don't mean, agreeing just to keep peace, pushing yourself into roles that no longer fit. These behaviors may have worked before, but now they feel heavy. Your body reacts faster than your mind, signaling misalignment through tension, exhaustion, or restlessness. This isn't weakness, it's feedback. Many people interpret this stage as losing motivation or not being myself anymore. In reality, you're shedding a version of yourself that was built around external expectations. The energy that once fueled constant doing begins to redirect inward, toward noticing, questioning, and feeling. That shift can look unproductive by old standards, but it's essential. There's also a subtle fear that can appear here. If you're not in control, then what is? The mind doesn't like unanswered questions. It prefers clear hierarchies and solid ground. Awakening, however, doesn't offer immediate certainty. It asks for tolerance of ambiguity. It invites you to stay present without rushing to conclusions. This is where many people try to go back. They force themselves into old routines, old identities, old ways of thinking, hoping the discomfort will fade. Sometimes it does, temporarily. But something always feels off, like wearing clothes that no longer fit your body. The relief is shallow, and the tension returns. If you allow the process instead of resisting it, something interesting begins to happen. The fear of losing control softens into curiosity. You start to notice that beneath the confusion, there is a quieter, steadier awareness watching it all. That awareness isn't panicked, it isn't rushing, it's simply present. This is the beginning of trust, not in outcomes, but in perception itself. You begin to rely less on force and more on listening. Decisions slow down, but they become cleaner. You feel less compelled to react immediately. Space opens between stimulus and response. That space is not emptiness, it's choice. And as that space grows, a new tension emerges. The old world still pulls at you, asking you to function the way you always have, to be normal, to fit back into familiar structures. You can feel that pull clearly now, and with it, the temptation to return to what is known, even if it no longer feels true. That tension doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It means you're standing at the edge of a threshold where the real challenge begins. When the discomfort lingers, the natural impulse is to escape it. And the most familiar escape is normal. You remember how things used to feel when life seemed simpler, when your role was clear and your reactions were automatic. Going back appears practical, even responsible. You tell yourself that whatever is happening inside you can wait, that it's better to focus on what's expected of you. On the surface, this seems like maturity. Underneath, it's a quiet form of self-betrayal. Normal is seductive because it promises relief. It offers structure, predictability, and social approval. You know how to perform it. You know which parts of yourself to emphasize and which to hide. Slipping back into those patterns can feel like putting your feet on solid ground after floating in uncertainty. For a moment, the tension eases. The questions grow quieter. The world makes sense again. But that relief doesn't last. Something in you resists fully settling back in. You notice it as a low-level irritation, a fatigue that rest doesn't solve, a sense of friction in situations that once felt smooth. You do the right things, say the right words, follow the old script, and yet your body doesn't respond the way it used to. The alignment is gone. What once flowed now requires effort. This is where the trap tightens. You assume the discomfort means you're failing at being normal, so you try harder. You push yourself to care more, to engage more, to suppress the inner signals that tell you something is off. Over time, this creates a quiet exhaustion that builds beneath the surface. Not dramatic burnout, but a slow draining of vitality. The reason this happens is simple, though not easy to accept. You can revisit old environments, but you can't return with the same awareness you had before. The line has already been crossed. Even if you recreate the outer conditions of your past, your inner position has changed. You're seeing through patterns that once held you together. Normal begins to feel narrow. Conversations loop. Goals feel pre-approved, not chosen. You sense that much of what is considered success is built on repetition rather than truth. Trying to fully re-enter this space requires shrinking parts of yourself, dimming your sensitivity, dulling your questions. And while that may work temporarily, it comes at a cost. Many people stay in this trap for years. They oscillate between moments of inner clarity and long stretches of conformity, never fully committing to either. They tell themselves they'll explore that deeper feeling later, when life is less demanding. But later rarely arrives. The longer you postpone listening to what has awakened, the louder it becomes, often expressing itself through frustration, cynicism, or a vague sense of being misplaced. What makes this especially confusing is that going back often looks successful from the outside. You may appear functional, accomplished, even stable. Others might praise you for getting back on track. But inside, there's a growing sense that you're playing a role you've already outgrown. The applause doesn't reach the part of you that needs to be met. This doesn't mean you abandon responsibility or withdraw from the world. The trap isn't engagement itself, it's unconscious engagement. It's pretending that nothing has changed when, in fact, everything has shifted in how you relate to experience. Normal becomes a mask rather than a home. There's also fear involved. Letting go of normal means letting go of certainty. It means admitting you don't yet know what the new shape of your life will be. That ambiguity can feel threatening, especially in a culture that values clear plans and quick answers. So the pull to revert isn't weakness, it's self-protection. But protection can turn into confinement when it's no longer aligned with who you're becoming. Each time you override your inner signals to fit back into the old world, the discomfort increases, not as punishment, but as feedback. Something in you is asking to be integrated, not ignored. As this tension grows, life has a way of responding. Challenges intensify. Situations arise that make it harder to maintain the old balance. Not to break you, but to test how deeply you're willing to honor what has awakened. The pressure isn't random. It's pointing to the next phase, where resistance becomes more costly than change, and where the question shifts from whether you can go back to whether you're ready to stand in what's unfolding. Once you stop trying to fully return to what was, the pressure seems to increase. This is the part that feels unfair. You finally begin to accept that something inside you has changed, and instead of things getting easier, they become more demanding. Situations pile up. Relationships strain. Unexpected obstacles appear where there used to be flow. It can feel like the world itself is pushing back. It's natural to ask why. Why now? Why all at once? Why does clarity seem to come paired with difficulty? The first instinct is to see these moments as punishment or resistance from life, as if you stepped out of line and reality is correcting you. But what's happening is more precise than that. Tests don't arrive to stop movement. They arrive to measure stability. They show you what you can actually hold, not what you hope or imagine you can hold. When awareness shifts, the system needs to know if that shift is temporary or embodied. Insight alone isn't enough. Many people have moments of awakening that fade because they were never integrated into action, choice, and behavior. Intensity appears when something deeper is at stake. Life begins to ask, quietly but firmly, can you stay here when it's uncomfortable? The tests often target the exact areas where you used to compromise yourself. Old dynamics resurface. Familiar triggers return. You're placed in situations that invite the same reactions you've always had. The difference now is that you can see them happening. You feel the pull to respond automatically, and at the same time, you sense that doing so would cost you something. This is where the strain comes from. Not from the situation itself, but from the gap between who you were and who you're becoming. Holding that gap requires energy. It requires presence, and presence can feel exhausting when you're not used to sustaining it. There's also a stripping away that happens here. Supports you relied on may weaken. People who once validated you may misunderstand you. Paths that felt secure no longer open as easily. This isn't abandonment. It's a recalibration of dependency. Anything that kept you anchored to the old version of yourself is gently, and sometimes not so gently, loosened. What makes this phase feel intense is that it removes shortcuts. You can't bypass discomfort with distraction the way you used to. Escapes don't work the same. Numbing behaviors lose their effect. You're asked to stay with uncertainty without immediately resolving it. That can feel like being tested beyond your capacity, even when you're not. But these challenges aren't random. They are specific. They arise exactly where alignment matters most. They show you where you're still trying to control outcomes instead of responding honestly, where you're still looking for external reassurance instead of internal clarity, where you're tempted to trade truth for comfort. Each test is an invitation to respond differently, not perfectly. You may not always succeed. You may react out of habit and only recognize it afterward. That's part of the process. The test isn't about passing or failing, it's about noticing. Awareness after the fact is still awareness. Over time, the gap between noticing and choosing begins to shrink. There's also a paradox here. The more you resist the tests, the heavier they feel. The more you argue with reality, the more drained you become. When you begin to meet these moments with curiosity instead of defense, something shifts. The intensity doesn't disappear, but it becomes cleaner, less personal, more instructive. You start to see that what's being tested isn't your strength, but your sincerity. Are you willing to live from what you've glimpsed, even when it complicates things? Are you willing to let go of outcomes that no longer align, even if they once defined success for you? Are you willing to pause instead of forcing answers? This is where many people turn effort into struggle. They try to think their way through the tests, to analyze every detail, to make sense of everything mentally. But these challenges aren't designed to be solved by logic alone. They're meant to be met with a different quality of attention. As the intensity continues, a subtle realization begins to form. The harder you search for certainty, the more elusive it becomes. The more you try to control the process, the more friction you feel. Something else is being asked of you now. Not effort, but observation. Not answers, but perception. And that shift changes how you move through what comes next. At some point, effort becomes the obstacle. After being tested, stretched, and unsettled, the instinct is to search for clarity with even more intensity. You read more, think more, analyze every feeling and every sign, hoping to finally understand what's happening and where it's leading. It feels responsible, even necessary, but slowly something strange reveals itself. The harder you seek, the quieter everything becomes. This is the paradox that catches many people off guard. Seeking assumes there is something missing that must be found. It puts the mind in a forward-leaning posture, always reaching, always scanning. And while that posture can be useful in the external world, it dulls perception when it comes to inner reality. Attention becomes narrow. You're so focused on what should appear next that you miss what is already present. You may notice this as mental noise. Questions multiply instead of resolving. Insights feel just out of reach. The more you think about your state, the less connected you feel to it. There's a subtle tension in your body, a constant readiness, as if you're bracing for an answer to arrive. That tension blocks the very sensitivity you're trying to access. The mind wants certainty. It wants a map, a timeline, a destination. But this stage of awareness doesn't respond to force or strategy. It responds to stillness. And stillness can feel threatening when you've been conditioned to believe that progress requires movement. You might sit quietly and feel restless, tempted to check something, read something, distract yourself. Silence doesn't immediately feel peaceful. It feels empty. But that emptiness isn't absence, it's space. Space where subtle signals can finally be noticed. When you stop chasing meaning, meaning begins to surface on its own. Not as a conclusion, but as a shift in perception. You start to sense small changes that were always there. The way your breath settles when you stop controlling it. The way a thought dissolves when you don't follow it. The way awareness naturally widens when you let go of the need to label experience. This is why logic struggles here. Logic is excellent at organizing what's already known. It's less effective at opening to what hasn't taken form yet. The more you rely on thinking alone, the more you circle the same territory. Observation, on the other hand, doesn't push, it receives. There's also an emotional layer to this paradox. Seeking often carries an undercurrent of anxiety, even if it's subtle, a fear of missing something, a fear of falling behind. That fear tightens perception. When you allow yourself to not know, even briefly, the body relaxes. And in that relaxation, awareness deepens. This doesn't mean passivity. It means a different quality of engagement. Instead of hunting for answers, you begin to notice patterns. Instead of demanding clarity, you allow it to unfold. Instead of trying to decode every sign, you let yourself feel whether something resonates or not. You may find that insights arrive in ordinary moments when you're not thinking about them at all. While washing dishes, walking, listening to someone speak without preparing your response. These moments don't announce themselves as important. They slip in quietly, almost casually. And yet they carry more truth than hours of intense analysis. As this understanding settles, your relationship with effort changes. You still act, decide, and move forward, but without the strain of constant seeking. You trust perception more than interpretation. You allow experiences to inform you instead of immediately categorizing them. This shift can feel like losing momentum at first. The urgency fades. The need to constantly do something about your inner state softens. But in that softening, something else becomes possible. You begin to notice how reality responds when you're not trying to extract meaning from it. Subtle opportunities appear, small alignments, encounters that feel timely rather than planned. They don't look dramatic, and that's why they're easy to overlook if you're still searching for something bigger. The paradox resolves itself not by effort, but by attention, relaxing into what's already unfolding. And as your noticing sharpens without force, it becomes clear that the world itself is not silent. It's been communicating all along, just not in the language of seeking. Once you stop straining to hear it, you begin to sense that responses are already happening, quietly adjusting to the way you're now present within them. When your attention softens, something unexpected begins to happen. Life doesn't suddenly become perfect or predictable, but it starts to feel responsive. Not in a dramatic, magical way, but in small, precise movements that feel strangely timed. You think of someone you haven't spoken to in a long while, and they reach out. You hesitate about a decision, and an unexpected piece of information appears that clarifies your next step. These moments don't demand belief, they invite noticing. What changes isn't the world itself, but the way you meet it. Before, you were pushing against reality, trying to shape it through effort and control. Now there's more listening in your actions, more pauses, more space between impulse and choice. In that space, feedback becomes clearer. The world seems to answer you, not with words, but with alignment or friction. You begin to sense this response in your body first. Certain options feel light, even if they're challenging. Others feel heavy before you can explain why. This isn't intuition as a mystical gift. its sensitivity sharpened by attention. When you're less busy forcing outcomes, you notice how situations actually affect you. Encounters change as well. You may meet people who say exactly what you needed to hear without knowing your internal process. Or you may find that some interactions naturally fall away without conflict or drama. There's less effort involved in maintaining what fits and less guilt in letting go of what doesn't. Things align not because you demand it, but because you're no longer resisting what's already true. The language of response is subtle. It shows up as timing, tone, and resonance rather than guarantees. Opportunities don't arrive labeled as such. They appear as invitations that feel quietly right. You still have to choose. You still have to act. But the sense of pushing against an indifferent world begins to fade. At the same time, this responsiveness can feel unsettling. When life answers you more directly, there's less room to hide. Your choices have clearer consequences. When you ignore inner signals, the feedback is immediate. A conversation drains you. A decision feels off almost instantly. This isn't punishment, it's precision. You may also notice that things speed up in some areas and slow down in others. What's aligned moves with less resistance. What's misaligned stalls no matter how much effort you apply. This can be frustrating if you're used to pushing through obstacles, but over time, it teaches discernment. You learn where to apply energy and where to pause. The world's response doesn't mean constant affirmation. Sometimes it shows up as obstacles that redirect you, a door that doesn't open, a plan that dissolves. These moments can feel disappointing until you notice what they prevent. They stop you from investing deeply in paths that no longer match who you are. There's also a sense of being met rather than carried. You're no longer waiting for permission or validation. You act from clarity, and reality adjusts accordingly. Not always comfortably, but honestly. This honesty builds trust, not in outcomes, but in process. As this continues, your awareness extends outward again, but differently than before. You're less focused on interpreting signs and more on staying present. You don't need constant confirmation. You recognize alignment through how things unfold, not through symbolic meaning. And yet, this responsiveness can create a new kind of distance. You begin to notice that not everyone is experiencing reality the same way. Some people move through the world as if nothing has changed, repeating patterns without awareness. Their concerns feel loud, urgent, and oddly disconnected from what you're now perceiving. You may feel the urge to explain, to share what you're noticing, to help others see what you see. Sometimes it works. Often it doesn't. And in that gap between your experience and theirs, another challenge quietly forms. Not about reality itself, but about relationship, about how to remain connected without losing clarity, and how to walk forward without demanding that others follow. As your perception changes, one of the quiet realizations that follows can be surprisingly heavy. You begin to see that many people around you are still moving through life the way you once did, focused on routines, absorbed in surface concerns, reacting instead of observing. At first, this can feel isolating. You notice the gap before you understand it. You may try to bridge that gap. You share an insight, mention how differently things feel, hint at the shift you're experiencing. Often, it's met with confusion, discomfort, or polite dismissal. The conversation quickly returns to safer ground. Plans, complaints, distractions. It's tempting to push harder, to explain more clearly, to wake them up to what seems obvious to you now. But awareness can't be transferred that way. What you're noticing isn't a flaw in them or a superiority in you. It's timing. Just as you couldn't have been convinced before your own shift occurred, they can't be talked into seeing what their system isn't ready to perceive. Awakening isn't an argument you win. It's an experience that arrives when the conditions are right. This realization often carries a wave of loneliness, not the loneliness of being alone, but of being unseen. You can be surrounded by people and still feel separate, as if you're speaking a slightly different language. This isn't because you've become distant or cold. It's because your attention has moved inward, while many others are still anchored primarily in external structures. There can also be frustration. You watch people repeat patterns that you can now clearly recognize. You see how much energy is spent on things that don't truly nourish them. You want to help. You want to shake them gently and say, "There's another way to see this." But when you try, it rarely lands the way you hope. This is where acceptance becomes essential. Not resignation, but understanding. Everyone is navigating their own threshold. What looks like sleep from your perspective is simply a different stage of engagement with reality. And just as you weren't wrong for being where you were before, they aren't wrong for being where they are now. As this acceptance deepens, something softens in you. The need to convince fades. The urge to correct relaxes. You begin to see that your role isn't to demand recognition, but to embody clarity. Presence becomes more powerful than explanation. How you listen, how you respond, how you move through situations quietly communicates more than words ever could. Relationships may change here. Some naturally drift. The connection weakens not through conflict, but through lack of shared depth. Others remain, but on different terms. You learn to meet people where they are without abandoning where you are. This balance isn't easy. It requires patience and a willingness to tolerate misunderstanding without defensiveness. You also begin to recognize a subtle humility in this stage. Awareness doesn't place you above others. It makes you more aware of how little control you actually have over anyone's process but your own. That humility creates compassion, not pity. You remember how convincing the old world once felt to you, how real its concerns were. That memory keeps your heart open. At the same time, boundaries become clearer. You notice when certain environments drain you, when certain dynamics pull you back into patterns you've outgrown. Choosing distance in these moments isn't rejection, it's care. You're learning how to protect the clarity you've gained without hardening against the world. There's also a quiet strength that develops here. You stop needing constant agreement to feel grounded. You stop measuring your experience against others' reactions. You trust what you're perceiving, even when it isn't mirrored back to you. That trust becomes a kind of anchor. And within that anchor, another understanding begins to surface. That moment when something appeared, when the shift first became undeniable, wasn't just a random occurrence. It wasn't given to everyone at the same time for a reason. It marked something specific about your path, about what you were ready to notice and carry forward. And as you continue walking without forcing others to follow, the meaning of that moment starts to reveal itself more clearly. That moment, the one you keep returning to in your mind, carries more weight than it first appeared. Not because of what it looked like on the surface, but because of what it activated inside you. The sign wasn't meant to impress you or prove anything. It wasn't there to announce a new identity or grant you a title. It functioned more like a key than a message. Before it appeared, something in you was already loosening. Your attention had shifted. Your old certainty had softened. The sign arrived not to start the process, but to confirm it, to mark the point where recognition replaced doubt. You didn't stumble into it by accident. You encountered it because you were already oriented toward noticing. This is what many people misunderstand. They think the sign gave them something new. In truth, it reminded you of something familiar that had been quiet for a long time. That sense of recognition, the feeling that it spoke directly to you without explanation, didn't come from belief. It came from memory. Not memory as a story, but as a felt knowing. You may have noticed that after that moment, you couldn't fully deny what you'd seen, even if you tried. You could question it, downplay it, rationalize it, but you couldn't erase it. That's because it wasn't information added to your mind. It was alignment. And alignment, once felt, leaves a trace. What the sign revealed isn't that you're special in a way that separates you from others. It showed you that you're receptive in a way that many people haven't yet allowed themselves to be. Receptivity isn't passive. It requires courage to remain open when certainty dissolves. It requires honesty to admit when old answers no longer fit. The sign also marked responsibility, not in a heavy sense, but in a quiet one. Once you see differently, you can't pretend you don't. You become accountable to your own awareness. Choices that once felt neutral now feel weighted, not with pressure, but with clarity. You begin to sense when you're acting in alignment and when you're acting out of habit or fear. There's often a temptation here to romanticize the moment, to turn it into a story about destiny or elevation. But the real meaning of the sign is simpler and more demanding. It points to participation. You weren't chosen to escape life, but to engage with it more consciously, to notice what others overlook, to question what's assumed, to slow down where others rush. You may also recognize that this quality has been present in you before, long before the sign appeared. Moments in your life where you sensed more than you could explain. Times when you felt out of step with conventional measures of success. Periods where depth mattered more to you than approval. The sign didn't create this tendency, it gathered it. Understanding this can be grounding. It reframes the entire experience from something that happened to you into something that revealed you to yourself. You didn't cross into a new reality because you were pushed. You crossed because you were ready to respond. This readiness doesn't mean you have all the answers. It means you're willing to live with better questions. It means you can tolerate ambiguity without immediately numbing it. It means you're capable of observing your own reactions instead of being ruled by them. These are quiet capacities, often unnoticed in a world that celebrates certainty and speed. As this settles, a subtle shift occurs in how you see your path forward. You stop looking for the next sign as confirmation. You realize the sign did its work. The remembering has already begun. What matters now isn't accumulation of insight, but consistency of presence. You begin to sense that what comes next isn't about discovering something outside yourself. It's about staying available to what's already moving through you, living in a way that honors that original recognition, not by declaring it, but by embodying it in small, ordinary choices. And as that understanding deepens, the question quietly changes from what the sign meant to how you're going to carry it into the life that continues to unfold around you. You crossed something that can't be uncrossed, not because the world changed, but because you did. And now the work isn't to chase more signs or search for answers somewhere outside. It's to stay honest with what you already felt, to live from that quieter awareness. Even when the old world pulls at you and asks you to forget, this new reality doesn't need you to explain it. It needs you to sustain it, in how you choose, in what you tolerate, in what you no longer force. Some days will feel clear, others will feel uncertain. That doesn't mean you're off track. It means you're awake inside your own life. You don't need to rush. You don't need to prove anything. Just keep noticing. Keep responding from presence instead of habit. That alone changes more than you realize. If you made it all the way here, write this sentence in the comments. I didn't imagine it, I noticed it. That lets me know you stayed with this until the end. And if this spoke to you, watch one of the videos appearing on the screen now. They continue this path quietly, without noise. If you want more like this, that's where to go next.